September 1st, 1939. Dawn breaks over the Polish plains. A distant rumble grows into the roar of engines. German tanks cut across the countryside, their tracks churning mud and dust. Overhead, Luftwaffe bombers streak across the sky, releasing bombs that tear through sleepy towns and shatter the morning calm. In Warsaw and nearby villages, civilians flee in terror, clutching children and belongings as the first shockwaves of war ripple through the land. Soldiers scramble, trying to organize a defense against a mechanized force they're ill-prepared to counter. The world holds its breath, watching a continent on the verge of collapse. This invasion, calculated and swift, is the culmination of years of political miscalculations, economic hardship, and aggressive ambition. It is not an isolated act, but the explosive result of ideologies, alliances, and unresolved grievances that have festered since the last global conflict. Europe teeters on the brink, and history is about to be rewritten. The world in 1939 was a fragile tapestry of unresolved tensions, economic despair, and rising totalitarianism. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, struggled with reparations, political instability, and widespread resentment. The Weimar Republic faltered under economic crises, hyperinflation, and unemployment, creating fertile ground for Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party. Hitler's rhetoric of national revival, territorial reclamation, and racial supremacy resonated deeply with a population desperate for stability and pride. Meanwhile, Italy, under Benito Mussolini, embraced fascism, seeking to recreate a modern Roman Empire. Mussolini's ambitions manifested in campaigns such as the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, revealing both Italy's imperial appetite and the League of Nations' inability to enforce peace. Across Asia, Japan pursued militaristic expansion, invading Manchuria in 1931 to secure resources and assert dominance, signaling the emergence of a global threat beyond Europe. Economic hardship compounded these tensions. The Great Depression of the 1930s devastated global trade, leaving nations desperate for markets, resources, and industrial security. Germany rearmed rapidly, violating the Treaty of Versailles, while Britain and France struggled to balance disarmament ideals with the reality of growing threats. Militaries modernized, stockpiled weapons, and trained for mechanized warfare, creating an environment where even minor provocations could ignite conflict. Diplomatic efforts repeatedly faltered. The League of Nations proved powerless against aggression, while appeasement became the prevailing strategy for Britain and France. Hitler's remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 went largely unchallenged, emboldening German ambitions. Italy's actions in Africa and Japan's incursions in China further highlighted the international community's inability or unwillingness to enforce peace. By 1938, Europe was teetering. The annexation of Austria, the Sudetenland crisis, and Munich Agreement demonstrated both Germany's aggressive strategy and the Allies' preference for concession over confrontation. The stage was set, a continent anxious, militarized, and ideologically divided, awaiting a spark that would ignite a global conflict. The late 1930s marked the final prelude to war. Hitler's ambitions extended beyond Austria and Czechoslovakia. He envisioned a Europe dominated by Germany, reshaped by ideology and military might. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, a non-aggression treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union, stunned the world. Secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, giving Hitler the confidence to invade Poland without fear of immediate Soviet intervention. Poland, strategically positioned between Germany and the Soviet Union, became the focal point of this escalating tension. Its modern but limited military faced the prospect of a highly mechanized and coordinated assault. Diplomatically, Britain and France had promised to defend Polish sovereignty, but uncertainty and previous appeasement failures left the response untested. Leaders on all sides miscalculated the timing, scale, and consequences of impending actions. Meanwhile, Japan continued its expansion in East Asia, occupying large swaths of China, and Italy consolidated control over territories in Africa. The world was witnessing a pattern: militaristic powers acting with impunity, diplomatic bodies failing to enforce agreements, and nations increasingly relying on strategic calculations rather than negotiations to secure their interests. Global instability made regional conflicts inherently dangerous, primed to escalate into a broader war. As September approached, Germany finalized its invasion plans. The combination of ideological ambition, military preparedness, and opportunistic diplomacy created a perfect storm. Europe, already militarized and anxious, had no capacity for restraint. The invasion of Poland would not be a localized campaign. It would be the ignition point of a conflict that engulfed continents, drawing in nations, colonies, and populations worldwide. The stage was set. The mechanisms of war, alliances, modern armies, propaganda, and ideology were aligned. What followed would be a chain reaction of unprecedented scale, marking the beginning of World War II. The outbreak of World War II cannot be understood without examining the failures of political leadership and diplomacy. Britain and France, traumatized by World War I, embraced appeasement as their primary strategy. The Munich Agreement of 1938, which ceded the Sudetenland to Germany, exemplified this approach. Leaders believed concessions would satisfy Hitler's ambitions, underestimating his ideological drive and disregard for international norms. Meanwhile, Germany exploited these miscalculations, presenting itself as a nation reclaiming its rightful territory while simultaneously preparing for a broader conquest. Ideological angle, totalitarian ambitions. Hitler's vision of a racially and territorially pure Europe drove aggressive policy. Nazi ideology fused anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and a lust for Lebensraum, living space for Germans, into a blueprint for expansion. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist regime sought to restore imperial grandeur, while in Japan, militarist leaders pursued dominance in Asia, asserting control over resources and populations. Ideology legitimized aggression, making diplomacy secondary to the imperatives of conquest and racial hierarchy. Economic angle, scarcity and militarization. Economic conditions further fueled tensions. Germany's rearmament was both an economic stimulus and a strategic necessity for Hitler's plans. Global depression had left nations vulnerable, hungry for resources and markets. Japan's invasion of China aimed to secure raw materials, while European powers faced the challenge of rebuilding military strength without triggering domestic unrest. Economic competition intertwined with political and ideological ambitions, creating an environment where war became not just possible, but likely. The outbreak of World War II was shaped by the unprecedented mechanization and coordination of armed forces. Germany pioneered the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combining tanks, aircraft, and infantry in rapid, coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm opponents before they could respond. France, Britain, and Poland struggled to modernize comparably, relying on slower mobilization and defensive strategies. With precision, panzer divisions surged forward, supported by Stuka dive bombers that rained destruction on military installations and civilian centers alike. Railways carried troops and supplies at unprecedented speed, enabling coordinated attacks that overwhelmed Polish defenses. Polish soldiers, brave but outmatched, fought desperately. Infantry units attempted to hold towns, cavalry conducted delaying maneuvers, and anti-tank guns were deployed in last-ditch efforts to slow the mechanized advance. Civilians fled in terror, their homes and livelihoods destroyed in the initial hours of the invasion. Warsaw braced for siege, and smaller towns along the border were swiftly occupied. Diplomatically, the invasion forced immediate responses. Britain and France, bound by treaties guaranteeing Polish sovereignty, declared war on Germany on September 3rd. However, they were unprepared for immediate offensive action, resulting in what would be called the Phony War, a period of anticipation and cautious positioning along the Western Front while Poland faced annihilation. The rapidity and ferocity of the attack shattered any illusion that appeasement could contain Germany. Hitler's plan relied not only on military might, but on timing and psychological impact, aiming to demoralize opponents and secure swift victory. Within days, Poland was encircled, its forces struggling to coordinate under overwhelming pressure. The first shots of a world war had been fired, and the continent, and eventually the world, was irrevocably drawn into a conflict that would escalate far beyond anyone's expectations. By mid-September 1939, the invasion of Poland had reached its decisive phase. German forces pressed relentlessly, encircling cities and cutting supply lines. Warsaw endured relentless bombing. Bridges, railways, and hospitals were destroyed. Polish units, despite courage and improvisation, could not withstand the mechanized and coordinated onslaught. Within weeks, the country was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union, following the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The world watched as alliances were tested. Britain and France, constrained by geography and logistics, began mobilizing forces in France and along the Maginot Line, but could not prevent Poland's collapse. The rapid success of German forces demonstrated the effectiveness of blitzkrieg and underscored the limitations of traditional defensive strategies. Military planners across Europe reevaluated tactics, technology, and doctrine in real time, realizing that a new era of warfare had begun. Meanwhile, Japan expanded its offensives in China, capturing strategic cities and resources, demonstrating that World War II was not limited to Europe. Italy prepared for campaigns in the Mediterranean and Africa, capitalizing on the apparent hesitation of Britain and France. The interconnected ambitions of Axis powers meant that regional conflicts quickly escalated, turning Europe and Asia into simultaneous theaters of war. The invasion of Poland was more than a military operation. It was the ignition point of global conflict. The combination of ideology, strategy, and opportunism created a cascade effect. Within days, the world had crossed the threshold from tense diplomacy to total war, and the stage was set for a conflict of unprecedented scale, involving millions of soldiers, civilians, and nations across continents. The immediate aftermath of Germany's invasion of Poland sent shockwaves across Europe. The country lay in ruins, cities bombed, railways destroyed, and civilians fleeing in chaotic streams. Millions of Poles faced displacement, starvation, and violence as German and Soviet forces divided the territory. Entire communities were uprooted, and the scale of human suffering foreshadowed the unprecedented civilian impact that would define World War II. Britain and France honored their commitments by declaring war on Germany, yet their initial military actions were cautious. The so-called phony war ensued along the Western Front, marked by tension and preparation rather than open combat. For Poland, however, there was no pause. Soldiers fought valiantly, but faced mechanized warfare and overwhelming firepower. Refugees flooded neighboring countries, straining resources and revealing the limitations of international relief efforts. The political consequences were immediate. Germany's swift success emboldened Hitler, reinforcing his strategy of rapid, decisive offensives. Diplomatic norms have been shattered. Treaties and international agreements proved insufficient to prevent aggression. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union solidified control over eastern Poland, exposing the moral compromises and opportunism inherent in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Economic and military mobilization accelerated across Europe. Nations prepared for a prolonged conflict, stockpiling weapons, reorganizing armies, and planning campaigns on multiple fronts. The initial invasion demonstrated that World War II would be total, involving not only armies but entire societies, economies, and infrastructures. The world had entered a new era, one defined by speed, scale, and devastation. In the months following Poland's fall, the consequences of Germany's aggression rippled across Europe and beyond. Military strategies were reassessed as nations recognized the effectiveness of blitzkrieg. France and Britain accelerated mobilization, constructing defensive lines and preparing for future German offensives. Meanwhile, Germany consolidated occupied territories, reorganized its administration, and prepared for campaigns in Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and ultimately France. Civilian life was transformed. Millions faced displacement, rationing, and the terror of aerial bombardments. The invasion of Poland set a grim precedent. Civilian populations would increasingly become targets, and entire cities could be destroyed within days. Refugee crises tested neighboring countries and strained humanitarian networks, revealing the human cost of modern warfare on a scale unprecedented in history. Globally, Axis ambitions expanded. Japan intensified its campaigns in China, while Italy eyed North Africa and the Mediterranean. The coordinated yet opportunistic actions of these powers made clear that the war was not confined to Europe. It had become a global conflict, intertwining multiple theaters and dragging colonies and distant nations into its orbit. The invasion also shaped perceptions of responsibility and morality. Appeasement, once seen as prudent, was now understood as a strategic failure. Hesitation and miscalculation by the Allies allowed Germany and its partners to exploit weaknesses, accelerating the conflict's scale and intensity. The stage was set for a war whose consequences would redefine borders, governments, and human lives for generations. By the end of 1939, Europe, and soon the world, was engulfed in total war, a conflict whose origins lay not in a single moment, but in decades of ambition, ideology, and miscalculation. World War II did not begin with a single action, but as the inevitable result of decades of political miscalculation, economic instability, and aggressive ideology. The invasion of Poland was the spark, but the tinder had been long in the making. A humiliated Germany, expansionist powers in Italy and Japan, and a world still recovering from the devastation of the First World War. Appeasement, nationalism, and the failures of diplomacy converged to create conditions in which war became almost certain. The human cost was immediate and immense. Millions of soldiers,